This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Anne Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Anne Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Leadership Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Our bold leader today joins us from the Big Apple in New York City in the United States of America. He is a former corporate chief and president of a consumer goods skincare product company, as well as a global digital child publication and education conglomerate. He gave it all up, a call to action to heal the American deep divides. He is the author of his best-selling book, American Schism. He presented his findings, his analysis, and his proposed solutions, his secret sauce, if you like, to the US Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He is also the recipient of multiple awards for his best-selling book, including 2 2022 International Book Awards, one for nonfiction and one for the best new nonfiction book. We warmly welcome Seth David Radwell and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Seth, what a joy to have you come on and have this conversation today. I've been super excited to explore your thinking, your wonderful best-selling new book, and to have this very critical discussion with you.
Well, thank you, and it's a really pleasure for me to be here with you.
First of all, congratulations. Apart from being an Amazon bestseller in various categories, I see you've also been the recipient of 2 2022 International Book Awards, one for Best Nonfiction and one for Best New Nonfiction. So you must be truly proud. And perhaps a starting point is, what do those awards mean to you? And what do you think the significance of those awards are?
Well, they mean a lot to me because, in fact, I just also won a Global Book Award yesterday. So I've had a few along with very good reviews. And it's important for me because it means that my message is resonating with my fellow citizens. As I think you probably know, and most of my career has been in business, and I really took a detour to come work on the project that led to American Schism. And I did so mostly out of concern for our democracy. So these awards and the reviews are affirming in that there are many Americans like me who, sometimes I call it the frustrated majority, who believe that there's a better path to rehabilitate our social discourse and political discourse.
Yeah. And, that kind of leads into the next question around why this book and why now. I know you wrote in the book that after the first year of the Trump presidency, you were concerned about the rising temperature, the kind of mood in the country, the kind of political rhetoric. Why this book? Why now?
So what I would say is, there wasn't one particular kind of cocktail party moment where I said, I have to do this. But over the course of a couple of years starting in kind of 5 or 6 years ago, I noticed that not only did our political discourse publicly collapse, and reason and data seemed to be increasingly replaced by rancor and acrimony. But I also noticed that my peers, CEOs of companies, increasingly would put their heads in the sand. They didn't want to engage because there was no upside. There's a fear of outraging some group or some in this outrage-based culture. So private sector leaders also disengaged. And I said to myself, what a recipe for disaster. The public discourse has collapsed, and private sector smart leaders don't want to engage. I realized that for me, it seemed like it portended the end of our democratic republic. And I started doing some research in 2018, which led me to kind of leave my career and work on this project, because I of course, and you don't write a nonfiction book to make money. I would have stayed in the private sector. I did this really because I think it's really important for our kids.
Yeah, yeah. And in the book, American Schism, you talk about the importance of a rational approach and a deep historical perspective. Can you share with us briefly, Seth,
Sure.
what are the roots of this rift, as you call it?
Well, so first of all, the book itself is an investigative tracing of the history of our divisions. And as a consequence, it goes all the way back to the Enlightenment and our founding. And one of the arguments in the book, Anne, is that most of the divisions we see today are in fact derivative of an earlier schism that happened at our founding. And that unless we better understand that original schism, we're not going to be able to reconcile where we are today. So yes, history is important. And I also argue in the book at various points that history can act as a salve for our wounds if only we would apply it. So we seem to forget history very easily. And that is a major obstacle in my view.
Yeah, and to that point, Seth, is it about understanding the historical context to learn from what they did historically to kind of heal those divides over the passage of time? I mean, I recall that you said this is not a new narrative. What can we learn from history?
So through the book's tracing, we see that there was this pendulum-like swing between these different ideas of what the American experiment should be. I describe it in the book as a pendulum. And as a consequence, we've had huge disagreements, which have led, as you know, to a civil war and many other violent episodes. But I also think in history, at times, we've used what I call a secret sauce, a special formula for getting past our agreements. For example, one such event that I detail in some depth in the book is the period between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, where yes, once the war was won, and we had this credo in the Declaration, but we had to figure out how to govern a country. That we needed to have a foreign policy. We needed to regulate commerce. We needed to have a tax system so we could pay for the war. Anyway, all these needs emerged, and there were huge disagreements about how to resolve them. And over the course of a couple of years, as we wrote the Constitution as a framework, we made huge compromises, which didn't please everyone. And in fact, there were huge debates at that time between these two different views of what America should be. And but productively, we were able to use this secret sauce to come together. And there are other episodes in our history like that. And contrastingly, there are episodes in our history where it's fallen apart. And so that's what I mean when I say, if we understand these incidents, these history episodes, and could understand what a secret sauce is, how do we get past them? That's helpful. Now, I will say that part of the ingredient in this special formula is about using facts and reason to craft solutions. So, of course, one of the reasons, going back to your earlier question, that I was increasingly concerned is because I felt that our current discourse had abandoned facts, that we're in an era where it seems like everyone has their own truth, and I don't think is conducive to solving public policy problems.
Yeah. Well, just for clarity for our audience out there, I mean, perhaps an important question is, these two enlightenments. On the one hand, you talk about the moderates and, going back to the early founders, George Washington, the first president, his chief advisor, Alexander Hamilton, and then, of course, John Adams. And then on the other hand, you talk about the more radical Enlightenment, right, the likes of Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Can you just simply help us understand how would you summarize each of these enlightenments?
Right.
What
Great
did the
question.
moderates stand for? What did the radicals stand for?
Yes, so this was the huge original schism. And as I mentioned, these two sides were kind of vying for what would dominate. Now, there are complex differences between them, but I can boil it down for your listeners to two things. For the most part, the moderates, as you mentioned, people like Adams and Alexander Hamilton, they very much eschewed democracy. They believed in what was called then an aristocratic republic, meaning that the educated, the capable, were needed to govern on behalf of their fellow citizens, not because they were elite, as we call them today, in some snobbish way, but because they believed that since so many were uneducated, the best and the brightest needed to come together to govern. I mean, the best example of this probably is Alexander Hamilton, who was, a self-made man, but brilliant. And as he was putting together solutions for the federal government, he needed competent people. So again, this aristocratic republic. Now, by the way, this goes back to the Enlightenment in Europe and the moderates like Montesquieu and Rousseau and Voltaire, many folks like that. And to some degree, those antecedents are discussed. Now, the contrary force was a major departure, which in my view started with the French Enlightenment, which viewed the role of the republic differently. So I should say that during this time, the concept of government was thought of as a social contract. There was a lot written about that. But for the radicals, the reason why they differed so much, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, is the radicals believed that the only sustainable form of government in the social contract was a representative democracy of the people, that everyone had to have a voice. And that was a huge difference from the moderates who really eschewed democracy. So that's the first big difference, this notion of having the republic being a representative democratic form versus an elite aristocratic ruling form. Now, the second difference, which I think is also worth mentioning for your viewers and listeners, the second key difference goes back to the fact that the French radical enlighteners had documented how for centuries there was a tacit collusion between the church and the monarchy to repress the people. And so it was the radicals who came up with this notion of the separation of church and state, that these were two separate realms that needed to not interfere with each other. So as Jefferson famously wrote, not only in this new republic should we have freedom of religion, we should also have freedom from religion. And many of the founders were, of course, deists who did believe that, if their faith was really separate from the civic realm. Now, the moderates were much more tolerant of religion being a part of the governing apparatus, if you will. In fact, there's a famous quote from one of the moderates that emphasizes this, which is Voltaire. He said, in French, it was, "Si Dieu n'existait pas, il faudrait l'inventer." And what that means is, if God doesn't exist, we have to invent him, meaning to keep the people in line, that religion was important. And that was very different than Franklin and Jefferson and Paine and some of the other radicals.
Yeah.
So those are the two big differences.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are very important distinctions. And in this United States, or perhaps sometimes less than United States today, how do you think the current brands of those former distinctions appear in the United States today?
Great question. So it gets a little complicated, as I discussed in the book, in that these two forces, this radical enlightening force and the moderates, ended up facing a third major influence after the founding of the country. And it started with what was called the Second Great Awakening. And that was where religious and faith-based ideals came back into the public sector in a big way. And the counter-enlightenment, and we call it in the book, it's a counter-enlightenment, because it really rejected reason as part of being the most important element of social discourse. So those three forces, these two enlightenment forces and this counter-enlightenment, that's the dynamic, the framework that I paint that goes through history. So as that way of background, I think the current, it's at a very interesting time, because like when I was younger, the wealthy elites were all Republicans, and the kind of more the people were Democrats. That was a lot of my youth.
Yeah.
Now you see, because of the emergence of, over the past couple of decades, a new type of populism, that it's very much reversed. So I would say, like, if you're trying to paint where we are today, relative to the old Republican Party, the Democrats are more the radicals, although they're also quite establishment. I mean, one thing I argue in the book is that the two parties were increasingly close together. So one could debate it, but the notion of having a more representative democratic voice, expanding the voices at the table, that was more Democratic in its recent a couple of decades than Republican. But of course, now with this new force of populism, there is a backlash against that that is popular, but again, wants to return America to some, I would argue, fantasy state from the past where basically white men had power. I mean, it is kind of a retrograde view of what America should be, which Trump so cleverly tapped into. So if you try to understand today's environment, you got to think of the traditional Republican and Democratic debate and what that represented, and then this more populist view that's happened really both on the left and the right. I mean, ironically, today now, I would say most of the educated elites are more Democrat than Republican. And the data show that people with college educations and who have white collar jobs tend to be more Democrat, although very wealthy people are often still Republican.
So if you had to summarize where we are today, what would you say?
I'd say that where we are today is you have forces on the extremes, both the left and the right, that are more interested in confronting each other and believing their way is the way that we need to move forward than the center middle, this frustrated majority. Now, I say that because my research shows that 70% of Americans, by far a majority, between 65 and 70, fall into this frustrated majority, meaning that they believe that, in fact, compromise is required, facts matter, we have to hear the other side. Now, the other 35% are the fringes, and they don't believe that. They would rather, I mean, they often use social media to make their size feel much bigger than it actually is. I mean, not that 30% is small, and this is both the left and the right. I think that's where we are today. We have these extreme forces on both the political left and right. In my view, they're counterproductive.
So going back to your original framework in terms of your moderate enlightenments and your radical enlightenments and then your counter-revolutionary enlightenments, what percentage of the population would you say fall into those three camps today?
That's tricky. I mean, I would say that the biggest concern of mine in recent years has been the growth of counter-enlightenment. That I think used to be a small percentage of Americans. It's always been existed. There've always been people who felt the church should be, and by the way, I'm very for faith and religion, but I don't believe it should play a dominant role in governance. So in that sense, I think the radical enlighteners were correct. Now, but what's happened today is this rejection of truth and this everyone having their own facts, which has been the growing portion of Americans, I think, is really detrimental. And that's what I think has almost, I won't say taken over, but it's dominated the last couple of election cycles to the point where many Americans feel like the pursuit of truth is no longer something they strive for, that it's not something we need. And of course, this plays very much into the global anti-democratic forces that are trying to muck up the notion of democratic republics, whether it's Putin or Xi or Bolsonaro or other autocratic leaders. So in essence, one way to think about it is that if the 20th century was in some ways a battle between the notion of this open liberal society and fascism or extreme communism, totalitarianism on one hand, the 21st century is turning into, so far, a battle between that same open society and autocrats, authoritarianism, which is really a growing model all over the world. Xi in China. So this is troublesome for the. I mean, it may be, Anne, that in 50 years we look back and say, oh, that little experiment with democracy for a couple of hundred years, what a shame. We've lost it, and we'll move back to some earlier era. Now, I should point out that my bias, and I'm very clear about this at the start, is that I believe the Enlightenment framework by which we use science and facts and to solve problems is superior. I think it's brought us more prosperity, and I could give you in the last 200 years than in the prior 2000. And if you look at the data, there's many people have made this case. 200 years ago, life expectancy on the planet was about 31 years. Yeah. Today, it's over 70. Yeah. 200 years ago, 4/5 of the world lived in tremendous poverty. And today, the portion of the planet, which is much bigger, of course, but the portion of the planet living in that level of poverty is 1/5, not 4/5. So there are many examples that show our inheritance from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution have served us well. I would argue that same framework holds the answer to things like global warming, climate change, various problems that face us now. But if we abandon it, I think we do so at our own peril. And so I do believe that this Enlightenment framework, which gets very short shrift today, it's funny, when I speak about this, in the last 50 years, there are many in the philosophical and academic circles as well that look at the Enlightenment as like, a couple of white men in Europe, telling everyone how the world works. And it's downplayed. And I think that's really a mistake. I think that's a misreading of what the Enlightenment is. I mean, sure, the postmodern movement in many academic fields, which challenges the Enlightenment, does so with the goal of inserting other perspectives in the dialogue, which is very important. But that movement wasn't so much created to reject completely the notion of reason and science. So that's where I think it gets messy.
Yeah, it's an interesting, a couple of questions come to mind. I mean, the first is, when Jefferson helped, crafted the Constitution, and he said we need to rely on fact and speak in a candid environment. I mean, in this day and age of myths and disinformation and conspiracy theories, what do you think part of the solution is in helping to regulate the media, protecting the freedom of speech, but equally ensuring that the truth is told and that there is an accountability? What regulations, what legislation, what do you think needs to shift to bring us back to the facts and the truth?
Okay, great question. And again, this is in the third part of the book. I lay out both structural changes and mindset changes for how to move forward. But media is one of the big topics. So since you ask it, let me go right there. There's a couple things. First of all, let's understand that from an economic point of view, accurate information is a public good. In other words, from an economics point of view, it needs to be protected because, like, for example, most citizens can't research every drug. So we have an FDA, which does the research for us so that we can make better decisions. But that's what I mean when I say information, I'm talking in the broader sense. There are regulations against financial institutions that try to prey on Americans that don't understand finance. There's a whole bunch of things that protect the consumer based on the need for information. Now, we used to have in media something called the Fairness Doctrine before Reagan abandoned it, which said that the public airways needed to present various points of view and focus on information and separate commentary from information.
Yeah,
that's been abandoned. So what it's called cable news today is not news. These are mostly opinion pieces. There are not really very many news shows left. There are some in print, but even those I think are more biased than they used to be. Similarly, in the social media world, there's no accountability. So when you see a post on Twitter or on anywhere really, it could be a person with that idea, or it could be a Russian bot that's creating these posts.
Sure.
So the answer is a couple of things. I think there needs to be some more regulation of media. I'm not arguing for the public to take over media. that I think that, we need to have a private sector solutions for this, but there can be more regulation in various forms. And I think we need to give incentives for the private sector to come up with solutions. And I'll give you an example, Anne.
Yeah.
Imagine a social media platform where every participator is authenticated. When we do authentication in our society all the time, you want to drive, you need to get a license.
Sure.
So there's authentication is a common theme, but yet in social media, there's no authentication. So first of all, if people were real and they had to stand by what they say on social media, as an example, I think it would vastly change the dialogue. Now the private sector can come up with new solutions that do these things, and the public should demand such. And so that's where I don't think the solution to the media problem you point out is entirely going to come from the government solving it. I think it's going to require entrepreneurs to solve it.
Yeah, but I think in addition to that, Seth, I think my question, is also what can government do or ought to be doing? If I think back to my days in South Africa, and at a young age, I was, had a major role in a retail advertising agency, and I worked in marketing. And, we had an advertising standards authority. It was an independent body. People could file a complaint if there was any misrepresentation. It was then up to the advertiser, to present to the Advertising Standards Authority their justification and legitimacy for making the claims they were making.
Right.
So the onus of proof was actually on the person who was was being complained about. And I'm not saying that is the model, but I'm saying that there were these regulatory bodies that regulated and governed and defined whether this advertising was legitimate or not. And so my question is, apart from the consumer side of it, what is it about, what should happen for these social media owners? What accountability, what independent body, and what can government or a regulator do to ensure that, yes, freedom of speech is protected, but equally, there needs to be a responsibility and an accountability to ensure that there is honest truth being told, and perhaps even punitive consequences for people who are misleading, misinforming, and creating these conspiracy theories that disrupt the social order that we live in.
I absolutely agree, Anne. In fact, I totally relate to what you're saying in your experience in South Africa. I was, of course, head of many consumer brands. Most recently, I ran a brand. I was the CEO of a company called Proactive, which is an acne brand. And we would spend maybe $5 million a week on advertising. And every ad that went on TV or in print had to be approved by, first of all, the FDA for claims on the medicine side, on the active ingredients, but also the FTC for claims about marketing. And we would often, if we violated those, we were punished. So your framework from advertising is actually very relevant in my view. And it's something I share because most of my career has been in that. So yes, absolutely. I think we need to hold, for the last decade, social media companies have tried to stand behind the notion that they're platforms, that they're not putting out content. But if they put out false content or content that creates violence, they need to be held accountable. And so I very much believe in that framework.
I know you recently went down to DC and spoke with the US Select Committee of Intelligence,
Right.
chaired by Mark Warner,
Yes.
I think of Virginia, and Marco Rubio, Vice Chair Marco Rubio of Florida. And of course, this, was a select committee of both parties. I'm curious to know, in presenting your findings and solutions, proposed solutions, what key solutions did you put on the table, and what was the response to your proposed solutions?
Okay, great. Well, very interesting. So, first of all, I should say that the Select Committee on Intelligence seems so politically motivated in DC in all arenas. this is a committee that really has a good staff and good working people, and the senators are committed to accuracy and truth. So despite their public faces, these are senators who really want to solve problems, and they're very concerned about polarization. And so we discussed a whole range of things. I mean, one was very much this notion of social media and media in general, and how it needed to be reined in. So what we were just discussing was probably, we discussed for almost 40 minutes, ideas, both regulatory framework as well as private sector incentives, things we just were talking about. So that was one.
Yeah.
I talked to them about, they're really concerned about polarization. So I shared some of my research with them and talked about these extremes versus this frustrated majority and how that dynamic works. And then I talked about some other structural reforms and mindset changes. So, for example, the structural reforms were not very popular because many of the senators don't want to go there. Things like term limits, ranked choice voting. I mean, I do lay out in the book a lot of structural changes that I think would be closer to what our founders had in mind. And yet the current political establishment is not very receptive to those. So there was some things like that where I don't think I made much headway. There was, though, for example, a whole other section of recommendations in the book relate not so much to structural changes like these, but more to kind of mindset changes and how we talk to each other. And there was a lot of interest in that. For example, I'll share a couple with you and your viewers. We all in America are increasingly in silos. And we used to have some democratic republics have obligatory national service, and we've had it over our history related to war.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering that if we should have a service where every American, when they're 18, spends a year doing service, for example, by going to another part of the country or listening to other Americans that are different from them. And if they do this service, maybe the government pays for their college. There's, in other words, programs that start much earlier in the educative arena, whether they're sponsored by the government or whether we have the government re-endow the idea of civic education. I mean, one of the problems we have today, that again is more mindset, is that the enlighteners of both persuasions wrote about this. A democratic republic requires an educated citizen to understand what their role is in a republic. And we've abandoned civic education, in my view, in the last 50 years. It's been crowded out by STEM education, so science, technology, math, which, that's all very important. But we cannot, when I was in school, things like debate clubs were really important. How to evaluate evidence and make a case. So I talked to the committee a lot about some of these longer term. Unfortunately, these aren't going to change the world tomorrow, but longer term changes that need to kind of establish more of a base for what a democratic republic means in education.
And what was the response? I'm sorry.
Very interesting. They were much more positive to that than they were to term limits. Some of the structural stuff. So I think there is increasingly an appetite to look for the government to create infrastructure around the early American experience, meaning young people, to get them to understand and close this gap and understand what the civic arena is all about. There's a wonderful professor at Harvard, Danielle Allen, who's written a lot about this, about the civic responsibilities and how to reinstill them. And so that of course is not a short-term change, but I think it's ultimately going to be very important.
Were there any, just briefly, were there any other proposals that seemed to resonate with them?
I think some of the staff members were open to the idea of ranked choice voting. And I think changing the way we vote, which I think is one of the structural changes that we can, if your viewers are not aware of it, ranked choice voting has been shown to be much more reflective of the electorate's desires. So, today, the last couple of decades, when there's a third party candidate, invariably he or she is a spoiler. That candidate takes votes from one of the major two parties and helps someone else win. In ranked choice voting, you could have more ideas. You could have 5 candidates. And if the one you voted number 1 didn't get in the next round, then your number 2 vote counts. So your vote counts again. And so consumers don't quite understand it, but it's actually quite intuitive, and it's really and that's getting adopted more and more, not at the federal level, more at the local level. But so that was a good discussion.
And Seth,
Well,
just on that with the ranked choice voting, I mean, if you can just clarify that for people, you know, how far down does it go? So you have vote number 1. If that candidate doesn't win, it goes to vote number 2. If that candidate doesn't win, does it go to 3? Does it go all the way down?
So let's say you have 5 candidates running, and we had this, like, for example, in the mayoral race in New York recently. You rank them in order, all 5. Now, the one who's in last place at the end of that, let's say it's candidate B, Bob. All of Bob's ballots, if they're in the last place, are taken. And since they all voted number 1 for Bob, these ballots, since Bob is now the last place, he's out. And the number 2 choice on all those ballots is given the vote. So now we have a new ranking based on using Bob's old ballots, because Bob's out, to go to the second choice for those electors. And similarly, now there are 4 candidates. So the lowest one there is then cast out. Let's say it's Jane. So Jane's ballots, if they say Jane first, it goes to the second choice. If it says Bob, it goes to the third, because Bob's out.
I got you. See? Yeah.
It's
a process of elimination.
Yeah, process of elimination. And you know, they use this in Alaska, they use this in New York, in local. I mean, it's increasingly being used. But the beauty of it is, you don't have to be, you know, the third party candidates or other candidates are not spoilers. They can put more ideas into the mix. So why is this beneficial? Well, for one, you know, you can be a third-party candidate without being a spoiler. But maybe even more fundamentally, since the election allows more candidates, you get more ideas in the discussion, in the space. And more ideas is always good, because in essence, public policy should be the result of a competition of ideas that win or lose. I mean, that's good. So when you really look at it, and I've worked with organizations like Rank the Vote, and others to help do this, Better Ballot Iowa. So there are many organizations in the country that are working towards ranked choice voting. Another one that they were interested in was campaign finance reform, which they would never talk about. I mean, because again, this is one where publicly most of the elected officials say one thing, but I think since Citizens United, many elected officials and staff members on the committees realize how unmanageable campaigns have become. I mean, in essence, it's one of the reasons why I argue in American Schism, the book, for term limits, is because I used to be against term limits, and I believe now that most elected officials at the federal level spend far more money and time getting reelected and solving problems. And that was not what the founders had in mind. And so if term limits is the way to get past that, we should really adopt them. And I laid this out in the book.
Yeah. You know, one thing that did strike me, and of course we need the scientific model of management, but you also allude to the fact in the book around what you call a just meritocracy, you know, who gets a seat at the table. And a lot of those views around who gets a seat at the table goes back to deep emotional fear. How do you use the scientific model of management and rational debate and facts and evidence to counter deep emotional fear?
There's no question that to some degree, the American experiment over 200 plus years has been largely a story of changing we the people from meaning white men with property, which it did when it was written, to where we are today, which has gone through a process of, under Jackson's presidency was the first time that all white men got to vote, but it was still white men. It wasn't women, it wasn't African Americans. So I think there's a distinction between some basic questions about the social contract, which I lay out in the book. Things like, do we believe in top-down or bottom-up government? Is government going to be we the people, or is it going to be Putin and Xi dictating down? And then the second one is, who gets a seat at the table? Who counts? I mean, those are fundamental questions that are, yes, they may be emotional, but I think they're value driven. They really are. Now, when it comes to evidence, I think, in the science, there's no question in the business community, there's a great deal of evidence that show that the more diverse group of people in a problem-solving environment, the broader the solution set. So, I mean, if you say to me, tell me about how the management model is conducive to having more people at the table, I would point out that in fact having different perspectives has been shown to have a more thinking outside the box, so to speak. So that's one. But on the meritocracy question, that's really interesting because I think here, meritocracy, which is in my view a core American value, it's sort of like, if anything, the America that's been envied over the world over the last 100 years has not been the America because America has large weapons. It's been America's been envied because it's the place where there's the longest experiment in self-government with all its flaws, and where there's a notion, or at least a dream, that anyone could make it, irregardless of how you're born, if you're born noble or not. So that's really what makes the American credo. Now, what I also argue in the book is that a meritocratic model is broken, and I point out why it's broken. Now, what's interesting about this, Anne, and I'm not sure how much your viewers are aware of this, is that over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been an increasing attack on meritocracy. A lot of books have been written, The Meritocracy Trap, a whole bunch, that argue that we should abandon the meritocratic model, that it's not working. In the book, I make the case that not only should we not abandon it, we need to fix it. It needs to be repaired. And here, it's both science and, it's both management science as well as values. And the best source for your viewers on the value side really goes back to John Rawls' A Theory of Justice in the 70s. Yeah. I mean, that was like the Bible of, how to think about a moral case for how the social contract should be constructed. And I do think that there's a lot in there that very much resonates to me. On the data model, the data show that, let me give you some data. It's not a meritocracy when you have such a different, in the competition for rewards, everyone's at a different starting point. So let me give an example. In a New York City public school, the amount of money spent on a kid's education in 5th grade is around $30,000. In a private school, for a 5th grade student, the investment is around $130,000. Now, and these investments are cumulative. So if you want 2 kids to compete, and one is getting an investment of $30,000 a year and the other one 5 times that, that's not a fair competition, right? So that's what I mean about the data show that we've increasingly, at times in our history, we've been very more meritocratic. A great example is the GI Bill after World War II, which gave real incentives to people coming back from the war to get their lives together. And this notion of, ever since the Reagan administration, of government being the problem has precluded any notion of redistributive justice from happening. And that's I think that framework is wrong. I think, it's amazing how, if you think about the industry that's in charge of managing and carefully investing people's financial assets, it's a huge industry. But we spend much less time talking about how to manage our private human capital. There's no question that education is the largest return on investment of almost any. So that's a whole other way of thinking about this when it goes to meritocracy. That's about really getting the starting line closer. It's never perfect, but you want to balance out and give everyone a chance. I mean, it's ironic that in the French Constitution of 1792, before the Reign of Terror, that was, by the way, the constitution that the radical enlighteners in France wrote, Condorcet particularly. Not only does the Constitution lay out a lot of the principles of the radical Enlightenment, it lays out that the responsibility for education in a democratic republic needs to be on the government, and that everyone needs to have access to a quality education in the civic fields. And it actually specified what they were talking about, science, So again, this was during the Enlightenment when there was an explosion of interest in the average person being able to acquire knowledge. It was so fundamental. We take it for granted today. I'm bringing that up because that French Constitution of 1792 was one of the most radical Enlightenment constitutions ever written. Now,
yeah.
In the book, I talk about what happened. The counter-enlighteners came in, and we had the Reign of Terror, and everyone was killed and hung, and it was a terrible outcome, which led to Napoleon. But there were periods of time in that process which were really interesting, despite having a much less successful outcome than the American Revolution, which was its counterpart.
That's so interesting. And I think talking about education and the power of education, turning to a leader, an iconic leader that we both have a great admiration and respect for, Nelson Mandela, he once said that education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. And, talking of Mandela, Seth, I was curious to hear, can you take us back to an untold Mandela moment, a moment in time when either watching, television or reading a book, that his life, his leadership, and even his legacy has touched or influenced you in some way?
Well, absolutely. So I'm going to go way back. When I was in college at Columbia in New York, it was around 1984, I think. Many of us had chained ourselves to Hamilton Hall to close it because we were increasingly concerned about the investment policy of the university in South Africa. And Mandela was a hero back then. I mean, he was, still in prison, and I was influenced by that particular part of the world early on when I was maybe 20, 21, because it was so representative. Well, it was brought really to me on campus, which I think, of course, Columbia wasn't the only place where.
No, it's spread across the whole of the United States.
Yeah, but it was a very important moment for me in my personal development. And, it was at that point that I started to research Mandela and saw that, what was an incredible journey, witnessed it.
Were you chained in the hall?
Yes, I was chained to the outdoor door, and it was, we were prosecuted. I mean, I was going to be expelled from the university, even though I had a 3.9 grade average. There was a bunch of public defenders that got the university to dismiss the case against us. So it was an experience from a long time ago, but I don't regret it. I mean, it was quite an interesting experience. To be fair, as brave as I sound, I was scared that I was going to get expelled from the university. I was worried about that.
But you still went through.
Yeah.
So that's a bold step. I mean, in your mind, what is your definition of leadership, and what is your definition of bold leadership?
Well, this is one of the things that my entire effort with American Schism is about, is a call to action. And here's the thing. I mean, so many of our fellow citizens in this frustrated majority, the 70% of Americans who believe we can do better, they don't know how to get involved. And to me, bold leadership is taking a step. So when I speak, I lay out all these organizations that are either fighting for the structural changes we've talked about or the mindset changes, and tell them how to get involved. And bold leadership, the Nelson Mandelas of the world are the rare, most people can't do that, but we can make a difference if we take a step or two. And part of that was what I was striving for in my Fight Unreason with Reason campaign, which argued that every citizen has a duty to take a step. And that may be as simple as rejecting the fallacious reasoning at the Thanksgiving table from an uncle. But it also may be, spending a little time volunteering or helping an organization trying to reverse Citizens United, or whatever the case may, whatever issue you care about. So I'm, part of why I'm doing this is to create a network for citizens to take a bold leadership step. And it may not be that huge, but a lot of citizens are scared. And going back to where we started, one of the bold leadership steps for leaders in the private sector is to not be afraid to confront these issues, to get their heads out of the sand. I was recently speaking with a CEO of a major education company, thousands of employees. And it's tricky because there's no, if a CEO is focused on short-term maximizing profits, there's no upside to taking these issues on. But if they think a little more broadly about how they've been successful in a capitalistic system with infrastructure and with citizens who are educated,
Yeah.
they should care, right? I mean, so that's
Yeah.
it's an issue of perspective, Anne. And so
Yeah.
I guess I don't know if I'm answering your bold leadership can come in many forms. It doesn't have to be putting your life on the line. It can be taking a risk in a smaller sense where you think you can make a difference.
Just switching gear a little, a couple of fun facts. I know you commute and live between New York and LA and Paris. I can think of many reasons of going to Paris. What is it about Paris that captivates you?
Well, LA is because I worked there for many years, and I do like LA, so I spend time there still. I still have some clients there, and Paris has always captivated me. I mean, particularly the reason why I'm spending time there now is because I'm trying to get the book American Schism published there. I have a couple of publishers interested. I mean, one thing the book does is it illustrates the linkages between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which were part of one overall movement against the Ancien regime. And so I think it'd be very interesting to a French public. And ironically, France is also a democratic republic struggling with the same forces of popularism and autocracy, et cetera. So as much of Europe is. The reason why I'm spending time in France more recently, in fact, I was supposed to speak at a conference there, is because I'm trying to get the book published there. But I happen to also personally be very enamored with France.
Yeah. From your childhood, what is a significant childhood memory that stands out that has shaped the state, the person you are today, the Seth that you are today?
Well, so the one I discussed about at Columbia is probably pretty important. If I go before that, earlier on, I mean, I guess my grandparents on both my maternal and paternal were immigrants from what was then Ukraine, or what we call the Pale of Settlement. They were Jews that were terribly persecuted. It was a very anti-Semitic period in history before the Russian Revolution and into it. And they came to this country with nothing. I mean, they both immigrated in my great-grandfather came in 1911 and then brought his family over. So they had nothing, and yet they believed, they kind of bought into the American dream. One of my grandfathers became quite successful. The other one, not so much financially, but they both were able to build a wonderful life. And that's so early on being shaped by the immigrant experience, which many in America have, and which, whether it's Irish or Italian, or, America is made up of these people who want to work hard and build a better life. That's why we're so great. And it's almost like that's gotten a bad rap today. So I would say to you, the early experience of my family life and the old country, I think was very formative for me.
Yeah. And the third fun fact, I mean, you talk about the American dream, you talk about in your book how it changed from what it was then to what it is now. For you personally, what would you love the American dream to be?
I would love it to reinforce what has always been, it's been known for. I mentioned this earlier, and there's two parts of the American dream. As the first part is that, as imperfect as it is, we have a model for self-government that's bottom up, a government of the people. And it's incumbent upon us to improve it, which is why I argue for the structural changes. So that's one. The second part of the American dream is that if you are diligent, work hard, and invest in yourself and your skills, you can be successful. And that is threatened today because of the problem with meritocracy. So that's why I address that. But those are the dual parts of the American dream. So much of the last 1,000 years, your life really depended on if you were born into a family of wealth, or you were born into the clergy, or everyone else, and that was it. That was your life. It was a fixed situation, and of course that started to change with the Reformation and Calvinism, but it really became, it went to a new level in the Enlightenment. So that's why this meritocratic model is so important to me. And that's the second part of the American dream.
Yeah. And in our final few moments, Seth, just any final words around what you think the future is calling us out to do today, and what do you think Nelson Mandela would say to not only the United States, but to world leaders today?
That's a terrific question. I would say it's about the next generation. And that's what we're, whether it's our kids and wanting them to live in a better world, or whether it's the planet and other species, that increasingly there's 1 million species on the planet, and there's one that's ruining it for all the others. And unless we, figure out how to confront things like climate change, we're going to be doomed. So it's about the future. I think it would be about the next generation. So, we have to make some sacrifice. We've had one, I'm very fortunate. I've had a wonderful life. I can't complain. I've had a wonderful career, and many of us have. But it's time to wait a minute. Do we want our kids to have those opportunities or not? So for me, It's about the future.
Well, Seth, it's been such a joy. Congratulations on your amazing work. I look forward to us doing more stuff together. And thank you for coming to share your powerful work and your compelling insights.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's been a pleasure.
The American Schism has shocked Americans and shocked the world. Some would say America has never been so divided, conflicted, and violent. On the Western Front, we experience a growing urgency to keep America and the Western world united, to keep America the United States of America, to keep the NATO alliance a united alliance, to protect democracies worldwide. Back home in America, on the American book front, best-selling books leave us feeling pessimistic. Whether we are reading Mary Trump's Too Much and Never Enough, or books about Barack Obama's failed presidency, or Michael Cohen's New York Times best-selling book, Revenge. On the American media front, we listen to conflicting news reports and feel confused. What are the facts? Or the alternative facts, if such a thing even exists? And is news really news? We listen to a contradictory version of the same truth. On the one hand, listen to MSNBC's Rachel Maddow or Ari Melber. And on the other hand, listening to Fox News anchors and hosts, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. On the American individual patriotic front, the extreme right and the extreme left leave us stunned. But there is a patriotic middle. Seth David Radwell wanted to be part of the solution. He hunkered down in his home office during the COVID pandemic, and he took dusty books off the bookshelves to analyze and understand America's history. He authored a best-selling, international award-winning book, The American Schism. So what do we learn and understand from Seth's analysis and understanding of America's history and this American Schism? The roots of America's conflict run much deeper than we initially thought. Contrary to popular belief, they are not unprecedented. They go back to America's origins and forefathers. On a positive note, these warring factions have found a creative solution and binding solution to help navigate America going forward. And perhaps a little counterintuitively, it is not about focusing on the ideological differences, the left or the right, the red or the blue, the fight for democracy, or the protection of an elite aristocracy. Instead, in order to inspire hope, we need to rationally understand and analyze America's history without judgment. We need to focus on the important conflicts. What are the pain points on either side? And like America's forefathers, we need to spend our time and energy on finding a creative and binding solution, the common glue. So as we navigate through these troubled times in America and a delicate Western front, I'm grateful for Seth Blackwell's passion, his analysis, and his insights. When we rationally analyze and understand our history without judgment, we can set aside our angry emotions and we can find the binding solution that will inspire hope. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.